points this out, but it's clearly the case. They learned that there is a way to maintain something remotely like a capitalist system, namely with massive state subsidy and direction and control. And they're the guys who had to know it because they were running it. So they didn't have to read it in textbooks, they had experienced it. Overcame the Depression with a big shot in the arm to the economy. Right after the war, there was a consensus, extremely broad consensus, going from economists like then young Paul Samuelson and others all the way across to business leaders, that if this government stimulus and support were to drop, we'd head right back to the Depression, which was pretty realistic. That's what pulled the country out of the Depression. Anyway, that was the consensus. And you don't have to go to secret sources at this time. The business press quite openly said that the government is going to have to do something about it. Fortune magazine pointed out that high-tech industry cannot survive in an unsubsidized, competitive, free enterprise economy. Business Week added that the government has to be the savior. There was pretty general agreement on this. It was understood, just like you learn in your elementary economics course, that any kind of government spending can serve as a stimulus, like social spending or military spending or, hiding dollars in the sand or whatever you like. They'll all work. They understood this. And in fact, there was a debate in the business press in the late 40s about which path to follow, social spending or military spending. And it was decided pretty quickly, explicitly in fact, that military spending would be a much better path. The reason was that social spending has a downside, even if it would work. First of all, it's redistributive. Secondly, it has a democratizing effect, because people sort of care where you're going to build a hospital or something. It's also not a direct gift to corporations. It sort of just filters indirectly. Well, military spending has none of these defects. It's a direct gift to corporations. It's redistributive, but the right way. And it has no democratizing effect. In fact, quite the opposite. People have no opinion on what kind of jet plane to build or something. So it's just perfect. And furthermore, it's easy to sell, and that was recognized too. The point was put rather succinctly by Truman's the first Air Force Secretary, Secretary Symington, Truman's secretary. He pointed out that, as he put it, the word to use is not subsidy, the word to use is security. And if you can get people to tremble in fear, you can carry out the subsidy, calling it security. So military spending is the perfect solution to the problem that, as everyone recognized, the capitalist system just isn't viable, and there has to be a massive public subsidy for it and some degree of intervention and control. Well, that was very widely understood. It soon turned to a kind of international military Keynesianism, as it's sometimes called. The revival of Japan and Europe very crucially depended on U.S. military spending after the meager and disappointing effects of the Marshall Plan were played out. But they did get revitalized for the Korean War and big military spending and so on. The Vietnam War had the same highly stimulating effect, at this time also for South Korea, which traces its economic takeoff to that. By 1940, and this is well understood, in fact, even before the Korean War, by 1948, the business press was hailing Truman's Cold War spending as a magic formula for almost endless good times. It's a way to inject new strength into the entire economy. By 1952, it was, quoting, obvious that foreign economies as well as our own are mainly dependent on the scope of continued arms spending in this country, which is serving as a cover for public subsidy under the guise of security, subsidy to advanced industry. I'm quoting Steel magazine and Magazine of Wall Street in this case. But it's typical, it's all across the board in the business press. And so the story continues. Just about everywhere. Take, say, computers, like sort of core element of a modern industrial society. In the 1950s, they were kind of big, clunky things with the vacuum tubes always blowing up and too much paper around and that sort of business. You couldn't sell them, in other words. So the public support for them was about 100%. They were designed under the security guise, like at Lincoln Labs at MIT, where I am, and where actually my wife worked as a programmer with a security clearance, so I wasn't supposed to know what was happening. They were designing what was called an air defense system. I doubt that anybody in it thought it was ever going to stop anything but maybe a World War I fighter plane that got lost. But the air defense system did develop the basic architecture and software and structure for modern computers. When it got advanced enough, some of the leading figures in that pulled out. One of them formed Dell, later IBM came along, and so on. By the 1960s, these things were marketable, and the public support reduced to about 50%, and it sort of oscillates up and back. In the 1980s, it went up again because there were fifth-generation computers coming along and parallel processing and all sorts of new fancy stuff, so the public share went up again. And this is pretty public, I should say. Like, say, Star Wars was sold to the public as a system, you know, we're going to defend ourselves from Martians or somebody. But to the business world, it was sold pretty frankly as just a subsidy to next generation of computer technology and lasers and so on and so forth. There was no big secret about it. And what's true of computers is true of just about anything else. In the 50s, about 85% of R&D, research and development, and electronics altogether was publicly subsidized, and it remains at various levels since. I won't go into details. The same is true of the aeronautical industry, of automation is a striking example. It was so inefficient that for several decades it had to be developed in the state sector, finally handed over to private enterprise. Containers and so containerization, machine tools is a dramatic example. It's well studied in this case, an important work by Dave Noble. The energy industry, nobody even argues about. Biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, in fact, just about every dynamic sector of the economy. That even includes services. So one of the biggest parts of the service industries is tourism, huge industry, which is, of course, aircraft-based, and an enormous source of profits for services to US-based companies. And so it goes. I will skip the rest, but as I say, it's extremely hard to find some dynamic sector of the US economy that doesn't rely on this kind of thing fairly crucially. Sometimes overwhelmingly, sometimes less so, but always significantly. Now, there are variations. It's not like a uniform story. So take, say, the Reagan administration. The Reaganites were extreme in their contempt for markets. They really hated them, in practice, that is. To the public, the Reagan administration was full of wonderful praise for the miracles of the free market. That's both to the third world and to poor people at home. To the business world, they were sending a different message. So Secretary of Treasury James Baker informed the business world that the Reagan administration, he boasted that they had instituted more protection for American business than any administration in post-war American history, which was in fact far too modest. It was more protection than all post-war administrations combined. They had virtually doubled one or another form of protection, amounting to tariffs, though sometimes by the devices. That was used, targeted specifically, to save the American steel industry, automotive industry, machine tools, semiconductors. It's unnecessary for aircraft because it's already publicly subsidized. That's what saved them. Otherwise, they would, if the free market had been allowed to function, they presumably would have been taken over by much cheaper and more efficient Japanese and other industries. But the market was effectively closed, and a lot of subsidies were poured in, and that saved the industries. And again, it's no secret. So like Foreign Affairs, in its review of the decade, points out later, I'm quoting it now, that the United States shifted in the 1980s from the world champion of multilateral free trade to one of its leading challengers, with the greatest swing toward protectionism since the 1930s. That much is true, but it's only a small part of the story. because it omits the huge public subsidies to high-tech industry, the initiation of new technologies, startup companies, the unprecedented public bailouts, the biggest nationalization in American history, and a lot more. There's a scholarly study of GATT by one of the chief economists of the GATT Secretariat, sort of the main study of GATT in the modern period. He estimates, Patrick Lowe is his name, he estimates Reaganite restrictions on free trade as about 3 times any foreign counterpart. This is, what he says, part of the sustained assault on free trade principles by the industrial countries from the early 1970s. There's no time to go into this, but the early 1970s are important. That's when the financial systems were deregulated after the Nixon administration broke down the Bretton Woods Agreement, something which had had an enormous effect on the international economy, probably the biggest change in world order since World War II, but takes us off in another direction, so I'll drop it. Important direction. Well, all of these things have had effects. One of the effects is the unprecedented redistribution of income toward the very rich that is complained about and attributed to the free market, and also the steady decline of the majority as we're moving towards a society which has notable structural similarities to the third world. It's very rich countries. It's not going to look like Brazil, but the structural similarities are quite obvious. I mean, take any third world country, and now Eastern Europe, now that it's going back to the third world where it belongs, and was for 5 centuries. There's a small sector, kind of like an island of extreme wealth and privilege. There's a big sector kind of ranging from suffering to outright misery. And there's just a lot of superfluous people who don't contribute to profit making, and you got to get rid of them somehow. In countries like, well, say, take the country that gets most of our military aid in the 1990s in the hemisphere, Colombia, there they get rid of them by just murdering them. That's what the military aid is for, social cleansing, large-scale killing by the military and the paramilitary and so on. We're more civilized. We don't kill them. We throw them into jail. So the jails are going way up, incarceration is completely uncorrelated with crime, far beyond any industrial society. In fact, we now are competing with the World Championship with China, and have been for some years and still going up. So that's a superfluous population. None of this is the result of the wisdom of the market, miraculous or not, but it is definitely the result of explicit social policy. Well, these effects, I should say, have led to real euphoria among the winners. The business press is pretty amazing in this respect. So in Business Week, in a review of 1996, points out that profits were spectacular. That's up from dazzling and stunning in the 2 previous years of double-digit profit growth, which has been going on through the last couple of years. By far the biggest winner that they reported in 1996 were what they call aerospace and defense. Defense is a euphemism. They're far ahead, maybe about twice as much profit as the competitors, which are also beneficiaries of the transfer of public funds to private profit in an earlier period. And that continues, again, reported in the business press. Like, you know, you read the Wall Street Journal and the back pages of the New York Times, you'll learn about it. So, for example, last November, Japan announced a new government program of up to about $1 billion to aid Japanese companies to regain the ground that they lost when the Reaganite programs of massive state intervention, mostly disguised as military spending, saved U.S. companies in semiconductors and gave them a big step ahead in chip making and other technologies, part of what makes possible our current passion in telecommunications. The same day, the Clinton administration announced a program to build new military jets with profits that are estimated, they may run to $750 billion or more when foreign sales are included, which will be aided, in fact, decisively by aggressive government intervention. Particularly interesting was the fact that in that proposal for this huge jet program, McDonnell Douglas was excluded from competition in favor of Boeing. And that was noticed by industry analysts. Boeing had just won a $1 billion contract for a laser system for 747s, called a defense system as usual. The reasoning for cutting McDonnell Douglas Act was, and in favor of Boeing was explained by Pentagon officials and by aerospace industry analysts. The reason is that Boeing has essentially the American monopoly for commercial aircraft, and therefore new technologies have to go to it directly to expedite the growth of commercial production, not just indirectly in the usual fashion. So therefore we'll give them the military jet contracts directly, and then they can just use it without wasting any time for commercial jets and remain the model of the free market when we preach the gospel. An aerospace analyst at Merrill Lynch pointed out that this involves a shift from a military-industrial economy to an industrial-military economy. It's kind of more frank, in other words. And in fact, actually that was a Pentagon official, one useful effect of the end of the Cold War has been to kind of lift the clouds. You know, it's kind of harder to maintain pretenses, so we'll now call it what it is, an industrial military economy, with military just used to, as much as we can, other devices if we can't, to ensure that that the rich don't have to face market discipline, which can be pretty tough. I don't want to suggest that business doesn't have any problems. They do. So about a year ago, Business Week had a headline saying, "The problem now, what to do with all that cash," as profits are overflowing the coffers of corporate America and are booming and so on. And that is a problem, because it's not really clear what to do with all that money. Just about a week ago, February 10th, Business Week updated it. They had an article pointing out that the liquid assets of non-financial companies in the United States had reached what they call a staggering $679 billion, and that poses vexing problems at places like Boeing and IBM and Intel and Ford. The problem is, what are you going to do with all this money? We can't figure out what to do with it. Meanwhile, in these lean and mean times that we live in, we have to be able to accept happily by far the highest poverty rate in the world, worse child poverty rate in the industrial world, in any industrial country, literal starvation, and all the other problems that just come from the miracles of the market. And we, of course, also have to reduce the capital gains tax, because it's important to free up funds for new investment, since the staggering $679 billion that's sitting there, nobody knows what to do with, so some new funds have to be gotten, and lowering the capital gains tax, of course, means transferring taxes regressively toward the poor, and all of this is to be understood, and you're not supposed to laugh about it. And in fact, it takes a pretty well-disciplined doctrinal system and a very well compartmentalized mind to be able to handle all of these things, and not to do what those 40 million Mexicans might have done if they were told that Cuba was a security threat. Well, there's a lot more to say about this, but let me just say a word about the earlier history, which is itself interesting, before World War II. You can learn a lot from that. In the 18th century, the differences between what is now the first and the third world were much less sharp than they are today. So, for example, India was the major commercial and industrial center of the world. It was producing more iron than all of Europe, for example, in the 18th century. And in fact, until the 1820s, British engineers were still going to India to learn advanced steelmaking techniques and so on. Actually, it's very likely that wages in South Indian industry were actually comparable or maybe even better than British industry, along with working conditions. There's interesting new scholarship on this. All of this raises some questions, two obvious questions. Which countries developed and which countries didn't? And secondly, what were the factors? Well, the first question we can dispense with very quickly. There's no question about it. Europe developed, and so did some of the regions that were free of European control. Two in particular, the United States, which had freed itself from European control, and Japan, which is the one part of the third world that was able to resist colonization. Japan brought along a couple of its colonies in tow. Japan was an extremely brutal imperial power, but it treated its colonies differently from the West. It developed them. So what is now Taiwan and Korea developed under Japanese rule at about the same rate as Japan. They didn't rob them, they developed them for whatever reason. So those are the two exceptions. The two parts of the world that were able to resist European colonization developed, again, something you're not supposed to notice, and maybe suggest something. What turned to the factors? Well, a lot of this is not very well understood. Economic growth is not a very well understood thing, but some things are pretty clear. So one of the most eminent economic historians in the world, Paul Weyrauch, who published an interesting book about all this stuff recently, points out that, to quote him, that there is no doubt that the third world's compulsory economic liberalism was a major element in explaining the delay in its industrialization, and in the very revealing case of India, the process of deindustrialization that turned the world's leading workshop and trading center into a deeply impoverished agricultural society with a sharp decline in real wages and food consumption and so on. Well, what about the successful societies? Again, lots isn't understood, but there are, I should mention that this is neoliberalism, what I was just describing, for the defenseless. The developed societies, though a lot is not understood, one thing seems pretty clear, and that is that, and I think it's without exception, from England up till the East Asian growth area, that radical violation of market principles was a significant factor, maybe the decisive factor, in their successful development, just as imposition of market principles was a major factor in the undeveloped de-development, or even deindustrialization of parts of the third world, maybe all of it. So say, take for example the United States. Like, how come we're not pursuing our comparative advantage in, say, exporting fur? Don't seem to be doing that. There was an industrial revolution, started around eastern Massachusetts with textiles, as it always does. How was the U.S. able to produce textiles? Is it because the textiles from Lowell were cheaper than England? No, they were much more expensive. England was providing much cheaper and better textiles, but the U.S. was free. So it was able to set up high protectionist barriers and to develop a textile industry with a big spillover to other related industries. The same is true of, say, steel. British steel was far better and cheaper than American steel a century ago, but high tariff barriers made it possible for Andrew Carnegie to set up the world's first billion-dollar corporation, along with big naval contracts and so on. Remember, he was a pacifist, but within limits. So we get a steel industry, and so it goes on up till the present. I gave a couple of examples. And this is not unknown. In fact, the U.S. is described, for example, by Weyrauch as the mother country and bastion of modern protectionism. In fact, it was way in the lead through the period of its growth. These are pretty much staples of economic history, but they leave out an awful lot because of the way academic disciplines are divided up. So protectionism is only one factor, and you can see that pretty clearly. Take, say, the Industrial Revolution. It was based, the major commodity in world trade, of course, and the core of the Industrial Revolution was cotton. There had to be cheap and available cotton for the Industrial Revolution to take place in England and then the United States. Well, how is it kept cheap and available? Like market forces? No. I mean, it was kept cheap and available by extermination of the indigenous population in the southeast United States and by bringing in slaves. It's kind of serious violation of market forces. Actually, Texas and a third of Mexico were taken over quite explicitly in order to gain, they hoped, a monopoly on cotton. This has nothing to do with the market. A contemporary analog is energy, where there's a large-scale public subsidy to the price through the whole military protection system. Well, factors of that kind are just not considered in economic history, and they're not considered part of of state intervention, but they means that it very much understates its role. There were other cotton producers back around the time that U.S. cotton took off, like India or Egypt, both major cotton producers. India just blocked by violence, so they destroyed the British managed to destroy the Indian cotton industry and textiles. In the case of Egypt, it was about the same. Egypt, it's hard to believe now, but it was a major agricultural exporter and a big cotton producer, and it was starting an industrial revolution about the same time the United States was, but that was barred. The British refused to allow independent development in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they were quite frank about it. Palmerston, foreign minister, said that no ideas of fairness to Egypt ought to stand in the way of such great and paramount interests of Britain as maintaining domination of this region and blocking competitors. The U.S., in contrast, was free to follow the course of the mother country, England, with radical departures from market principles. England, of course, did turn to liberal internationalism famously in 1846. That was after 150 years of protectionism and violence, and in fact organization of Europe's most efficient developmental state, had led to double the per capita capitalization of any other country. So under those conditions, a level playing field looked pretty nice, and England did turn to liberal internationalism, but with some significant reservations, even then, the period of free trade. So about 40% of British textiles went to colonized India, and that was pretty much true of British exports generally. When British steel was priced out of international markets, they could still export to the colonies. By the 1920s, when Britain couldn't compete any longer with more efficient and modernized Japanese industry, they just called the game off. In 1932, the empire was effectively closed to Japanese competition because free market wasn't working anymore. It's part of the background for World War II. Other countries did the same. At that time, if you look, Indian manufacturers were indeed pleading for protection, but from England, not from Japan. But under the way markets work, no, that wasn't the answer. The conclusion is quite general. Free trade is fine, great game, as long as you're going to win. A century after England, in 1945, the United States turned to the same direction. It abandoned its high levels of protectionism and called for a free trade, international liberalization. That was after 150 years of violence and massive protectionism and market interference had put the United States way ahead of any competitor. It actually had half the wealth of the world at the time, and a level playing field looked like a nice idea, but again with reservations. So complementary development, as it was called, was going to be blocked in other countries, and it was by force, and there were massive subsidies through the military system and others, also to agro-export and other devices, to make sure that the level playing field was still tilted radically in the proper direction. By the 1980s, the Reaganites just called the game off again, as I described, and today, the sectors of the economy that were helped to get back in business and regain the lead, they're now passionate advocates of the free market. Well, I think that's the relevant, I've barely touched on it, but that's the relevant history of the telecommunications agreement. No miracles of the market, but there is a law. Markets are great if we're going to win. In fact, there is what we might call really existing market doctrine. Market discipline is good for you, but I need the protection of the nanny state, so not for me, please. The really existing doctrine is operative policy, discipline for the defenseless and the poor, like 7-year-old children. They have to learn responsibility, but the rich and the privileged, for them, a powerful state. look at the Reaganite policies, makes this very clear. It's getting late, but let me give just one last dramatic illustration. I'll take the lead commentator of the New York Times, Tom Friedman, who says that with the hawk-dove distinction over, the issue now is between the safety netters, as he calls them, and the let-them-eat cakers. This, everyone agrees, he says, on globalization, and that's, we can't even talk about that. But there is a distinction, and he picks two examples. Clinton, example, the safety netter. Gingrich is an example of the integrationist, let-them-eat cakers. That's about 2 weeks ago. Well, that's not like a tautology. It's an empirical thesis, which means you can test it. So we can take Gingrich and ask whether he's an integrationist, let-them-eat caker. Well, how do we test it? Well, for example, Gingrich was in Congress during the 1980s, and we can ask how he voted during this massive assault against free markets for the benefit of the rich, who did indeed benefit. How did he vote? Well, in favor of it. Okay. Conclusion number one, he's certainly no integrationist. He doesn't believe in global markets. What about the let-them-eat caker? Is he an example of that? Well, there's a way to test that too. I mean, he's a congressman. He represents a district, namely Cobb County, Georgia, which happens to win the national championship in federal subsidies among suburban counties. The only exceptions are the ones that are part of the federal government itself, like, say, Arlington, Virginia. They get a little bit more. That's where the Pentagon is. But if you go out of the federal system, Cobb County is first. So he's achieved in fact, the whole Atlanta region is like this. So the fact of the matter is that Gingrich is the leading advocate of welfare dependency, a really existing market theory, full of all sorts of rhetoric about third world peasants and poor children. They have to learn responsibility and this kind of thing, but not his rich constituents. They require a powerful nanny state to maintain their welfare dependency. Well, these are not big secrets. And it's a kind of a task of a doctrinal system to conceal all of that so that the losers, who are the majority, accept their fate quietly. And this, incidentally, is completely general. It's not the United States. I'll give only one example to illustrate how general, but it's completely universal. There's a recent technical study, the only detailed one I know of, the top 100 transnational corporations in the Fortune list. It's just published in England by 2 economists. They just run through the top 100 highest corporations in the Fortune list, and they look at their policies and record and so on, a lot of interesting stuff. One conclusion is that all 100 benefited from the industrial policy of their home country, and 20 at least, they say, were saved from complete destruction as enterprises by either massive state takeover or huge bailouts in their home country. One of them is Gingrich's favorite cash cow, Lockheed, which was given a $2 billion bailout by the Nixon administration. That's the way the world works. Going back to minimizing the state, yeah, there's minimizing the state, but that's maximizing not the people's rule, but the private power which lies behind it and is designing social policy. That's where decision-making is transferred. And furthermore, these corporations don't believe in free trade. You have to, not quite apart from the massive subsidies and socialization of risk, remember that what's called trade that's a kind of an odd word for it. Over half of U.S. trade, what's called trade in the United States, over half of it is intra-firm, within a particular firm. That's internal to a huge command economy run by a very visible hand with all sorts of techniques of undercutting market effects and so on. And this is pretty well understood. The last comment I'll make is the following, and I'll just leave it as a question. There is this question about use of public funds for private profit. There are some real questions there. Some of them are non-trivial. One question is, how should public funds be used to create the basis for the future economy and intellectual culture? Real question, non-trivial. Second question, should the results of all of this, whatever it is, be handed over to private power through the socialization of risk and cost technique that we use. Third, should the issues be discussed in the public arena? That is, who should decide? Well, the first question you can certainly argue about, maybe the second, I don't think so, but on the third there shouldn't be any debate, at least among people who think that democracy might be a good idea. That is, they ought to be discussed in the public arena and ought to be a public decision, not something that people are manipulated and deceived into accepting with all kind of fraudulent rhetoric about the wisdom of the market and, you know, minimizing of the state and responsibility and so on. At least, again, for people who think that democracy is something useful to think about. Thanks. We have some time? Yeah? Okay. Are there some mics down there or not? Okay, if anybody wants to say anything, I'll try to repeat it so others can hear. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry.
I wanted to know what you felt like was the appropriate way for people like us to respond to some of this, the increasing centralization of power among corporations, you know, democratization of our society. What are some of the most exciting responses to that you see going on? What are the exciting alternatives to that, and how can we plug into those?
Can you hear? Yeah. Well, the first way to plug into it is to realize that it's happening. I mean, if your picture of the world is what is presented across the board, say from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal through the New Yorker to the Progressive, if that's your picture of the world, you're not going to plug into it because you're not going to understand what's happening. So the first thing to do is to break out of the doctrinal controls, which are very strong. I mean, I didn't quote a lot, but it's a fair sample. Self-liberation is the beginning. That's very hard to do alone. That requires organization. It takes a lot of fanaticism to sort of work through all of this stuff on your own. That's what groups are for. Like unions used to play this role. They educated people. They brought people together to think about things. So the first task is some kind of interaction and organization which will make it possible to contrast the image of the world with the reality of what's happening. After that, with some conception of what's going on, there are a lot of ways to react. In fact, mechanisms are in place right now which can enable people to react. If this same study of transnational corporations that I mentioned pointed out that about three quarters of their interactions are internal to Europe, Japan, and the United States. Okay. And they're all heavily dependent on their home countries for markets, for subsidy, for bailout, for everything else. Well, these are three areas of the world where there are formal mechanisms in place that enable the public, at least in principle, to exercise some role in public policies. It's like none of these countries are going to have a military coup, let's say, if people decide something the wrong way through their elected representatives. That means that even with existing mechanisms in place, there are very straightforward ways to deal with this. It's not a law of nature that social policy has to be designed so that the rich are protected from market discipline and children have to face it. That's not a law of nature. You know, you can change all that, and you can change it with existing mechanisms. Furthermore, you know, it's a good question whether existing mechanisms just happen to exist. They're not holy. You know, they've been changed all through history. If you go back to the real sources of classical liberalism, I think you find that the existing mechanisms are inconsistent with it. There are good principles there which ought to be thought about. So, for example, take, say, the patron saint again, Adam Smith. I mean, like everybody studies paragraph 1 of Wealth of Nations, where he talks about how great division of labor is. But not many people get to, I don't know, whatever it is, page 463 or something. I'm picking a number out of my hat. But anyway, deep inside, when he says that division of labor is a monstrosity, because it's going to turn people, he says, into creatures as stupid and ignorant as it's possible for a human being to be, and therefore it must be resisted in any civilized and developed society by some kind of government interaction, action to block it. In fact, if you look at Smith's argument he does give an argument, kind of a nuanced, an argument for markets, sort of, although he had a nuanced view of them. Take a look at the argument. Good or bad isn't the point at this right now, but the argument is that free markets will lead to perfect equality under conditions of liberty. That's the argument for them. Well, if they're not doing that, then as far as his principles are concerned, they're no good. You go back to other major figures in the classical liberal tradition, they were against wage labor on the grounds that standard formula, if a person does a beautiful thing on command, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is, because he's not a human being. De Tocqueville described it in the phrase, the art advances, the artisan recedes. It's an unacceptable form of existence. And it goes on and on like that. Well, these ideas are run right through the independent labor working class movement in the United States. It has nothing to do with Marx or anything else. You find it in 1850, you know, working class press and so on. It's a very natural idea. People ought to control their own labor. They shouldn't be like chattel slaves, some other kind of slaves. These are ideas that can be rethought. The power of modern corporations is not something that was given by nature either. These were decisions, and indeed not legislative decisions. Those of you from the law school surely know about this. These were judicial decisions, pretty recent ones, in fact. It's early in this century that corporations got the immense power that they now have, mostly through courts and lawyers, roundabout legislatures. It's not laws of nature. You know, you could go back to classical liberal principles and put them under public control, democratic control, and so on. That's going beyond existing mechanisms into principles. But yeah, we could reconstitute ideas that were once pretty standard, you know, in fact, across the board. But even with existing mechanisms, there's plenty that can be done. Incidentally, as far as this globalization business is concerned, it's described as if it's something so overwhelming that what can we do? Fact of the matter is, by at least gross measures, like say trade and investment flows and so on and so forth, by gross measures, the level of globalization now is about what it was in around 1913. It's relative to, to the economy, in fact. There are some differences, in fact, some striking ones, like the rapid flow of financial speculative transactions. But that's controllable, too, which had a devastating effect on economies. And it was understood. In fact, one of the people who pointed out the effects was right here, James Tobin, back around 20 years ago, who gave an important presidential address to the American Economics Association, in which he pointed out that the freeing up of financial markets was going to have a destructive effect on the international economy. It was going to lead to low growth, low wage, and though he didn't say it, high profit economies. And he even suggested some rather simple mechanisms to deal with this. It's called the Tobin tax, small tax on speculative short-term transactions, which probably would slow down financial flows. It's been on the agenda for years, never been enacted, because the masters of the economy, who prefer a different social, social policy, they want the profits, and they don't care if the public goes down the tube. But those are all mechanisms that are, maybe that tax wouldn't work. You don't really know until you try. But it's one of several devices. But there's plenty of technical ideas around about how to deal with this, and there are general mechanisms to implement it, and there are perfectly good ways to challenge the basic assumptions of the institutions, which have been changed throughout history. All of human history is a matter of challenging authoritarian structures, asking them to justify their legitimacy, and if they're not legitimate, dismantling them. The whole of human history hasn't come to an end. How you can do this? Well, only way there's never been a magic key. The only way that's anything has ever been achieved, whether it's the end of feudalism or the overthrow of fascism or Bolshevism, or you pick it, women's rights, name anything you like, comes from struggle. Comes from education and organization and activism aimed usually at specific things, but going off to broader issues and so on. If there's another technique, it's been kept a dark secret. That one has been used for a long time with positive results.
I'd like to ask if you read the article by George Soros in the Atlantic Monthly, and what do you think about it?
George Soros in the Atlantic Monthly. This was an article in which he was saying that the rush towards free markets is going to be destructive in its impact. I would say more or less the same thing I said about other criticisms, like the one in the Progressive. I think his heart is in the right place, but his picture of the world is completely false. There is no rush to free markets. There's a rush to something very different, you know. And in fact, it's not a rush. It's just the history of the last couple hundred years. The history of the last couple hundred years, taking, of course, new forms as things change, is what I said, I think. Markets are great for you, and if you're poor and defenseless, I'll ram them down your throat, but I'm going to have a powerful state to protect me. And that's right in front of us. I mean, Newt Gingrich and the Reaganites are perfect examples. Take, say, the Heritage Foundation, you know, which crafts the budget for the right-wing Republicans. You'll notice that parts of the state are minimized and other parts of the state are maximized. So the military budget keeps going up. You know, it used to be we had to protect ourselves from the Russians. Okay, no Russians. In fact, they're allies. They're contributing to U.S. technology. So we therefore have to have a military budget that's actually higher in real terms than it was under Nixon, and it'll probably go up. And they want it to go up even faster. Actually, there's a reason for this. It's interesting to look. The White House every year sends Congress a message, you know, like around the spring, telling them, here's why we need a big military budget. The interesting one to look at was spring 1990. It was March 1990. The reason that's interesting is the Berlin Wall had fallen, you know, and even the most extreme maniac, maybe bar a few, couldn't believe that the Russians are coming. You know, maybe Richard Pipes still believes it, but most people couldn't accept the idea that the Russians are coming in March 1990. If you look at the report that the Bush administration sent to the White House, which was incidentally not reported in the press as far as I know, but it's a public document, it's quite interesting. I've written about it. If you're interested, it's available. It was quite interesting. It was the same as all the others. You know, we need a bigger military budget. We need the defense industrial base has to be maintained. You know, the whole thing, it all has to go up. Why? Well, not because the Russians are coming. I'm quoting. It's because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. Okay, that's why we've needed all of this. Up until now, it's because the Russians were coming. Okay, now it's because of the technological sophistication of third world powers, which incidentally we're trying to build up. Part of Lockheed's profits come from selling advanced jets to third world countries so that they will be a military threat, requiring that we build F-22s, you know, at zillions of dollars to protect ourselves from it. And if you read Lockheed propaganda, they say it straight out. You know, say it's a dangerous world out there. It's getting even more dangerous when we're selling them upgraded F-16s. You know. And so yeah, this is there, you know, and I kind of lost track of your question at this point. Sorry, I'm off on. Remind me of your question. Oh, Soros, yeah. He's missing all of this, you know. He just doesn't see what's happening in the world. I mean, he can read the front page story in the New York Times about the telecommunications industry and our passion for free markets and not understand that this is just what's been going on for a couple hundred years. The guys who are going to win because they've had plenty of public subsidy and support think that competition is great. Okay, up till the point where they're going to lose, at which point it's out the window, like democracy. So I sort of you know, I agree with a lot of the mood that he's conveying, but it seems to me extremely misleading not to present the world the way it is. You know, you want people to do something about things. You have to begin by getting a kind of a tolerable grasp of reality. If you don't have that, it doesn't matter how good your sentiments are. And I just don't think that's a tolerable grasp of reality. Well, that you can figure out, but anyhow, that seems to be the thing that's missing.
What hopes, if any, do you invest in burgeoning third parties?
Third parties? Well, you know, I think they have interesting possibilities. There is, for the first time ever really a Labor Party. It hasn't run yet, but it's around. The new party, which is coming out of mostly Wisconsin, has a good idea behind it. If they can reach sufficient scale, it could be effective. I mean, they have a long-term program, which is actually pretty much the program of the Christian right, which was the right program. Kind of build structure at the local levels, win the elections you can, even if they're for school board, you know, then have fusion candidates. They're trying to push through fusion principles so you can, you know, vote on your own line for somebody else, so you don't throw away your vote at say a federal election, and try to keep getting closely involved with community development programs, which they're doing, sometimes even with business support. All of this makes perfect sense. It's a question of scale, energy, commitment, and so on. In my view, there's 3 or 4 of these initiatives. They obviously ought to get together. They're all going right down parallel paths. And to split the minuscule energies that are around doesn't make any sense. That's been a perennial problem, I need not say. There's a big, I mean, look, there was just a meeting in Washington, which was kind of interesting. It's also interesting that it wasn't covered by any of the media, even C-SPAN. It was the Progressive Caucus of Congress, which is 50 people. It's a pretty lot. And they had a day-long session in Washington on Capitol Hill, which was quite interesting. I was there. I gave a talk there, in fact. I mean, that kind of talk has never been heard on Capitol Hill. It was ranging from sort of, you know, mainstream liberal Democrat all the way over to pretty militant left. Not a peep out of anyone. That's a big part of Congress, and it reflects, I think it probably reflects a majority of the public, at least if you can believe in opinion polls. And that's a lot of potential. Can be, how much it can work through the political system, it's pretty hard to say. After all, we have about 150 years in which the political system has been mostly a matter of competition among groups of investors who invest to control the state. But that's not a law of nature either. So yeah, I think there's potential there. Way back.
Yes, could you talk about the expansion of NATO, the meaning of it, and also, is there any opposition in the Senate or in Congress against it?
There's opposition in Congress, but, you know, for reasons that I don't think, I mean, you know, you can have your own opinion about it. Mine is kind of negative, but the opposition in Congress is for different reasons, mostly kind of chauvinistic reasons, I think. Why should we bail out the damn Europeans, sort of. I think it's a very problematic move. I mean, I think it makes sense to move towards various kinds of integration in Europe. Depends which kinds. But I can't see any constructive result that can be achieved through NATO that can't be achieved through European Union type arrangements. Except for one thing, it keeps US power over the whole system, which is in fact part of what NATO was for in the first place. Not so much to defend against the Russians as to make sure that Europe went the right way. And European elites are in favor of this because they're worried about their own working classes and so on. So in my view, it's a dubious move, although some kind of integration of parts of Eastern Europe into a general system are not a bad idea. I mean, you could say the same thing about, say, NAFTA. Is NAFTA a good idea or a bad idea? Well, there's no answer to that question. A free trade agreement linking Canada, the United States, Mexico, maybe other places, that might very well be a good idea. But NAFTA, in my opinion, was a very bad idea because that's not what it was. It was something quite different. It was an investor rights agreement which was highly protectionist and happened to be, it was predictable that it was, and predicted that it was going to have a very negative effect on all 3 countries, and it has. For the countries, not for the rich. They've gained. And this was pointed out at the time, depends what kind of NAFTA, you know, not NAFTA, what kind of NAFTA, that's the question. It was never allowed to be debated, incidentally, although it was the position put forward by the labor movement, by the Office of Technology Assessment in Congress, by plenty of independent dissidents, but that was never allowed to be part of the discussion. It was either this version of NAFTA or nothing, but the real issue is what kind, and I think the same arises here. It's not integration or nothing, it's what kind of integration. one under the rubric of NATO seems to me kind of starting off on the wrong foot.
Why do you think the doctrinal system remains in place? That the one that keeps people acting against their own interests or failing?
It does, well, first of all, because it's not against the interests of the people who are running the system. They're doing fine, including people like us. You know, people, I mean, I don't know you, obviously, but my guess is that you're kind of like me. You know, we're people who, in fact, do pretty well out of the system. Like, I haven't checked out the numbers, but I'm sure my personal income went up a lot faster because of Reaganite policies than it would under alternatives. People who are graduating from this law school, they're going to do great. You know, the ones who are the doctrinal managers, and of course who have their hands on the levers of power, they do fine. And the same is true in the third world. The people who you go down to, say, you know, Brazil or India or, say, you know, Russia or other parts of the third world, Russia is part of it again, you find that all of these programs are strongly advocated by educated elites, by the business world and so on. Sure, they're going to do fine. In fact, you go back to the British Empire, when India was being converted, remember, from the leading industrial commercial power in the world into a deeply impoverished peasant society with real horrors. And that was all strongly supported by educated sectors in India and elites, up till a point where they wanted, mostly out of nationalist on grounds, to take it over for themselves. So the people, the elements who have internalized the, I don't say they're lying, you know, the elements that have internalized the beliefs and, you know, write these things, yeah, they do pretty well. That's in their self-interest, and that's as old as history. It may happen that and in fact, I think it does happen, that it harms most of the population, but policy is not made for the most of the population. Actually, you can learn that from Adam Smith if anybody wants to bother reading him, instead of praying to the shrine. He pointed out quite accurately, well, I'll just quote him, he said that in England, he's talking about England, of course, he said, in England, the principal architects of policy make sure, private interests who control the state, make sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, no matter how grievous the impact on others, including the people of England. Well, okay, he didn't have the data to prove that, but in fact he was right, it turns out. Yeah, the principal architects of policy in his days, as he said, the merchants and manufacturers of England, do use state power to protect their own interests, and very effectively, no matter what happens to others, including the people of England. And I don't think that principle has changed since Adam Smith. What he was, I mean, everybody knows he wrote a book called Wealth of Nations. But less known is the fact that he knew that the notion of nation was a myth. There's no such thing as national interests. There's internal divisions in the nation. The merchants and manufacturers have a completely different interest than most of the population. And talk about the prosperity of nations is just mythology, as he was aware. That was later called class analysis, but he was certainly aware of it and explicit about it. So that's what you have to ask. Who's gaining and who's losing? And you'll find out that the domestic population quite often loses, even if the powerful and wealthy sectors are gaining. And I think we're seeing that very dramatically right now. You see it in the wealth distribution figures and the deterioration of democratic structures and the whole business. Way back.
Yeah, as a law student here, it's fairly obvious that a lot of what you're talking about has been extended into the legal academy through the School of Law and Economics, sort of importing ideas of efficiency into studying law, and in turn going to use law as a means of increasing quote-unquote efficiency.
Economic efficiency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And my question to you is what is your sense of the sort of most creative response to that school of thought in the legal arena?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, as a law student, you, I'm sure, know or ought to know that this has been going on for a couple hundred years. I mean, the whole American and, in fact, British legal systems were transformed through the 19th century, everything from tort law on to everything else, to facilitate the developmental state and the accumulation of power, profit, and the rise of corporations and so on. There's very good work on this. The best thing I know is Morton Horowitz's 2 volumes on Transformation of American Law, which goes into this in considerable detail, but there's plenty more. So yeah, the New Law and Economics group is just doing the same thing. What they're talking about as efficiency is indeed efficient for the wealthy and the powerful, maybe not for anyone else. And it seems to me the right way to respond to it is to put it in its context, which is a long history, and then to evaluate the arguments on their merits, obviously. And if you find, as I think you will, that the merits are pretty thin, to ask who's benefiting from this kind of ideology, and should we pay any attention to it? Why not have a different legal system that supports different interests?
You were speaking a minute ago about the myth of the nation, and I'm wondering, especially given your role as an academic and how you've chosen to politically engage that, if you would speak to the myth of the university, and in particular, I think that we don't even need to go to this so-called third world to see so many of these issues. We can just step outside to New Haven.
You can see them right here with the graduate student strike.
Right. So I'm very interested in what Noam Chomsky has to say about Yale and the struggles and the various conflicts and resolutions that have comprised themselves here.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the university is a bastion of privilege and power inside a very ugly society. And as you say, you can go a couple blocks away and see it, and in fact, even internally, there are similar divisions. What can you do about it? Anything you choose. You know, you're not going to be tortured. You're not going to be sent to the gulag. The worst thing that'll happen is people will scream at you, and maybe you won't get a job. There are worse fates. You know, that's not nice. You know, it's not nice to be abused and hated and so on, and maybe to be cut off from, you know, being as rich as you might be. But the penalties for action in a rich country, free and rich country like this, are so minuscule as compared with what people are facing all the time, everywhere in the world. You just can't even laugh at it. You know, well, so we can make our choices. There were attempts at Yale, as you can find out if you don't already know, about 20 years ago, to open up the campus to people in the community, like bring in people for, you know, evening courses run by students and things like that. That was squashed pretty fast. There are possibilities for all kinds of engagement with community issues. And after all, you know, we're not stuck. I mean, it's important to deal with New Haven, but there's a much bigger world out there where lots of things are going on. And in a university with all kinds of capacities to deal with these issues, they can be thought about too. Like our policies towards Brazil and India can be an issue here. I mean, like there's 15 million or so children dying a year, according to the World Health Organization, from easily treatable diseases, you know, which would require maybe a couple of pennies a day in aid, you know, like diarrhea, you know, they need salt or something, measles, which you can protect people against. Well, we can do something about that. We don't have to help kill 15 million children a year if we don't want. There are millions of women around the world who are dying from pregnancy-related diseases, most of them easily treatable, hospitals right close, you know. It doesn't have to happen, you know. New Haven is a serious problem, but our outreach is far greater. It's simply a question of how much you feel like doing about it. No, I don't mean you, I mean everybody, me too. You know. But the repercussions, personally, are so small as compared with what people face who are really fighting these battles that you can't even discuss it. I mean, I was in Colombia, just to give an example, a couple of months ago with an Amnesty International mission. Colombia receives more military aid and training from the United States than any country in the hemisphere. It's under the cover of drugs, but it has almost nothing to do with drugs, as any human rights group report or expert analysis will tell you. The murders are going on at an unbelievable rate, mostly military and paramilitary. According to America's Watch, our military aid is going to go up. You go down there, I mean, there are people, you know, peasant women, priests, other people who are working out there under horrendous conditions, I'm getting, like a friend of mine who was there, I met a guy who was there, who's a law student from the University of Michigan, who was working in human rights work, and in one of the church-based human rights groups. I met him when I was down there, and we were in contact. A couple months later, I got an email message from him. He was in hiding in Bogota, sending indirectly an email message. He was in hiding because he had gone out to visit a human rights worker out in one of the outside towns, and while he was there in the guy's house, paramilitary elements who work for the military and who are funded by us, they came in, took this guy outside, murdered him in the front of his children, and he was able to save one of the children by dragging him away. Then he had to go into hiding because he'd witnessed it. If he stayed there, he'd be killed, and then he had to figure out a way to sneak his way out of the country. Now he's back in the United States. This stuff is going on all the time, but the people are still going out. I mean, we don't face that. You know, we can't talk about costs. And that's not just Colombia, that's a lot of places.
I have two questions. First, I won't preface in any way trying to spell the outcome, though it involves a great deal, and you've been insinuating, saying that, you know, still we live under a largely free society. I feel in practice and enforcement-wise that's true. But what do you feel the prospects, given the new counter-terrorist legislation?
Mm-hmm.
We do have a state of political prisoners in this society.
Yeah, we do.
Certain sectors of the population are much more restricted and less seen, and most of the rest of the society is anesthetized to see it. And perhaps that it may affect in the future what your feelings on that. But the real question I'd like to ask, you seem to be encouraging broader thought for, and that is, what do you feel about the function of technology and industrial society as it's accumulated in, you know, empirically measurable ways through history, especially in the recent period?
Yeah, what's the effect on this?
You state yourself as, you know, holding anarcho-syndicalist views. I feel I'm an anarchist in a very core way in terms of favoring you know, future society that relates to more primitive, at least philosophy and social relations, if not actually questioning structures of technology, division of labor, and so on.
Yeah, I understand. There were two separate questions there. Let me see if I can summarize them quickly. One is that when I talk about people being free of repression and that sort of thing, that's certainly not true for sectors in American society, in fact, big sectors. Like if you were a black male in Washington, D.C., it's a different story. Then you're facing police terror. That's absolutely true, but we're not black males in downtown Washington. You know, we're part of the rich and privileged sector, so it's different. And there's a lot to say about this. In fact, if you're a working class, ordinary, median income family, you know, say a working class person whose working hours have had to go way up just to keep food on the table, and whose wife has to go to work full time, not because if she wants to, fine, but forced to keep food on the table, and you're both spending 50 hours a week, and there's no daycare, and you know there's no money for health care, and so on. You just don't have time to think about these things. So that's, maybe you don't call that police repression, but it's something that controls people. But we're not that kind of people. You know, we're free. You know. So yeah, it's a capitalist society. You gotta. Freedom's a commodity like anything else. If you got enough money, you buy a lot of it. All of us can buy a lot of it. There are other people who can't buy so much, so for them it's harder. Incidentally, they're the ones who do things despite the repression, and just as in Colombia and so on. But your point I agree with. However, I don't think it applies to us, the opposite. No, I don't think so. I don't think that in a rich, wealthy society like this, the wealthy will ever permit wealthy dissidents to be repressed. I mean, I've been through this a lot of my life. I've been sort of in and out of jail, close to long jail sentences, and so on. There's never been anything that I could call repression. And it's not because, you know, I'm loved by people in power, like, you know, as on Nixon's enemies list, you know, co-conspirator with your Bill Coffin in a court case and so on. It's just that wealthy and powerful sectors in the United States do not want the state to be strong enough to go after people like them. Okay, well, that happens to offer us plenty of protection. And I don't think the Counterterrorism Act will affect that in the least. I mean, yeah, anything could happen, but I mean, I think this is speculation off in Mars. I mean, in the real world, we are unusually free. On the other point, on the question of technology and anarcho-syndicalism and so on, I don't quite see it the way you do. I mean, it seems to me that anarchism and anarcho-syndicalism in particular were not against technology, and they were not in favor of a more primitive organization of society. There are strains in the anarchist movement that were primitivist, but certainly not the anarcho-syndicalists. I mean, their big achievement was organizing Catalonian industry, which is pretty advanced. That was an idea about how to develop, to organize democratically an advanced industrial society. As for technology, I mean, I don't think it makes sense to be against it. I don't even know what that, you know, in fact, there are real problems in the world, and they're going to, if they have any solutions, they're going to have technical solutions. That's true of environmental problems, of health problems, of all, you know, cultural problems, and so on. The technology in itself is mostly neutral. You know, technology doesn't care. I mean, let's say a hammer, okay? I mean, you can use it to bash somebody's head in, and if you give it to a Brazilian torturer, that's maybe what they'll do with it, or you can use it to build a house. You know, the hammer doesn't care. And the same is true of the internet. And just about any technology you can imagine. In fact, it's pretty hard to think of a kind of technology that is inherently oppressive or liberatory. They're all, everything depends who's controlling them. So it seems to me we ought to welcome technology and use it as a means of liberation and freedom from oppression and so on. Let's take automation, okay? I mean, if you could, you can't be done right now, but suppose you could really robotize to the point where you get rid of the kind of work that nobody wants to do, not you, not me, not the people who are forced to do it. Suppose you could get machines to do it. Terrific, you know? You free people up to do better things with their lives. The same is true of, now maybe the way it's being used is to drive people into poverty and out of work and so on and so forth, but that's a social decision. The technology doesn't care, you know. You can use it in other ways. And I think that that's true across the board. I don't myself think it makes any sense for anarchists to be opposed to technology. I think they should welcome it and ask for it to be used to free people.
Do you think that we can have any hopes on a resurgent AFL-CIO given world wage pressures both now?
Yeah. Is there any hope for a resurgent AFL-CIO given the world trade situation? Yeah, I think there's plenty. First of all, the world trade situation, let me stress, is not radically different than it's been in the past. In fact, it's not unlike the early part of the century under British hegemony and with the gold standard. So it's not that there's some, I mean, there are changes, like radical financial flows, but they're controllable, I think. But in most things, it's not all that new. You know, there's an idea being given to you that it's some fantastic thing that we can't control, but have a look at the facts. It's not true, and I think this is pretty well known to economists. You know, you can read about it in standard sources, or just look at the numbers. So yes, there's plenty of problems, and they may require, and in fact do require, I think, new forms of working class solidarity of the kind that were contemplated and in fact implemented a century ago in, say, the internationals, which were internationals, remember. So, for example, now German workers and American workers have very similar interests. For example, German workers have very significant interests in preventing the southeastern United States from going even deeper into the third world than it is now. They don't like it when Daimler-Benz shifts production to Alabama because they can get third world conditions there. You know, where workers are paid a fraction of the wages of German workers with no benefits, and the state pours in resources to, you know, protect them and so on and so forth. So, in fact, you know, members of the German unions have come here to try to talk to U.S. workers about organizing jointly to protect the common race to the bottom that's being forced on them by their common oppressors. And U.S. workers do the same with Mexico and Guatemala, you know. Or Indonesia and so on. Yeah, I think international interaction is very important here, and the United States plays a sort of an intermediate role. Remember, production workers here are not the highest paid in the world by any means. They're going down relative to the industrial world, even in terms of purchasing power, you know, which is the proper measure, though the United States is still the richest country in the world, not for production workers. In fact, this is the only industrial country where wages have actually declined in the last 15 or 20 years, along with benefits and security and everything else. So we're somewhere in the middle of all of this. Third world from some points of view, first world from others. And that does require international solidarity on the part of working people, which is harder to work out than solidarity between, you know, say Indiana and Michigan. But of course, there's a lot more means to do it too these days than there were 100 years ago. Is there an opportunity for a revitalization of the U.S. labor movement? Yeah, I think so. Why not? There's terrific work on this subject by a Yale historian, David Montgomery, who has a book, for example, called something like The Rise and Fall of the House of Labor. He's a labor historian, done great work on these topics. The rise and fall of the House of Labor is about the 1920s. The fall of the House of Labor took place in the 1920s. That's when the labor movement in the United States was finally crushed by, as he puts it, in a very undemocratic America, with plenty of violence, including the Wilson administration and so on. But that was the 1920s. In the 1930s, it rose again. In fact, to new heights that it had never reached before. Okay? We're not, I mean, things are bad, but they're not the 1920s. It's way better than that. And there's no reason why it shouldn't rise again. In fact, people like us could do a lot to help it.
The last thing that you just said, we are not the 1920s, and I was just shocked. I'm not American born, so I didn't even know that there is a law that was enacted in 1926, it was put into place, and now we see that in 1997, the President of the United States goes and stops the strike. And if that's not government intervention, then I don't know what it is.
Of course it's government intervention.
Washington, they say smaller government, smaller government. In the meantime, you hear this kind of thing.
You're right, and it's exactly what I said. Smaller government for you if it's going to help you, but bigger government for me if it's going to help me. Yeah, yeah.
If I may continue, I have never seen you on television here to be interviewed about anything. Have you ever been? Because I saw you in Dutch television, and I saw you twice in Greek television as recently as Christmas, being interviewed about a range of things.
Yeah, all over the place. I just came back from Brazil, where I spent an hour and a half in a national televised press interview. I just came, before that I was in Australia. I gave a talk at the National Press Club, live televised, you know, all over the country. Yeah, sure. But that's understandable. Look, if that weren't, if it wasn't happening in the United States, I'd begin to think I'm doing something wrong. I mean, why should television, which is a commercial, incidentally, I personally do better on commercial than on public television, but why should any of these systems want to offer publicity to somebody who's trying to say they ought to be destroyed?
Well, did NPR ever call you to ask about East Timor? Because I did call them when they announced the two winners, Mr. Horta and Peter, and they were falling all over each other on the radio on what is this East Timor, and I called them up and I said, instead of you falling over each other, why don't you get in touch with Professor Chomsky? He has written extensively and so forth. Did he ever call you?
Well, actually, the day that, just to give an example, the day that José Ramos Horta is an old personal friend, and Bishop Bello I also know. He's been mostly in East Timor, but when he came here I met him. And I've been involved in this issue for 20 years extensively. But the day that the Nobel Prize was announced, I did get plenty of interviews. In fact, I even had a long interview in the Globe, but it was not the Boston Globe. It was O Globo in Brazil, ultra-right-wing newspaper. The Boston Globe, I know the people, you know, we're even personal friends. And in fact, they got into the issue to the extent they did through my incessant hammering at their door, but the same with the New York Times. But here they have a different agenda. And from their point of view, rightly. You know, you can't, It doesn't make a lot of sense to criticize General Motors for trying to raise profits, okay? And it doesn't make a lot of sense to criticize the huge corporations that control the media system for trying to protect their interests. I mean, I don't think we should like it or accept it, but the way not to like it or accept it is to eliminate the power, not to blame them for doing what they're obviously going to do given their institutional nature. If you go outside the United States, of course it's different. Actually, even inside the United States, it's more nuanced. Let me drop myself because I don't want to make this personalized, but I can give you plenty of examples. There is, I don't know if, you probably don't hear it much here, but there is a guy named David Barsamian who does a lot of alternative radio. It turns out to be is another technology that could be used if people would do something instead of, you know, wailing about the problems. It's extremely cheap to get on satellites, turns out. You know, really not a lot of money to put something up on a satellite, and then it can be picked up by radio stations anywhere. You know, he's been spending he runs a small community-based radio program a station out in Boulder, Colorado. And one of the things he's been doing for years is putting on the satellite tapes of talks. Like, say, maybe he'll do, I don't know who's televising this, but maybe he'll do this one. But he does lots of talks of mine, of Howard Zinn's, of, you know, Ed Said, of a couple other people who are wandering around rabble-rousing. And he has a record now of years of how it works, and it's quite interesting. He's even written about it. He's virtually excluded from the Eastern Seaboard. But as you move further to the west, it kind of opens up, like in Des Moines, you know, or Central Oregon or Idaho or someplace. They'll run his tapes. And I think that's similar to what you're describing. And there's a pretty good reason for it. If you're in the ideological and power centers, it makes a lot of difference what you think, you know, and what you believe, because you're going to be in a position to make decisions that affect things. If you're off in central Idaho, you can think what you like, you know. You're not going to bother anybody. And in fact, the controls decline. And it's the same in Greek television. Those crazy Greeks want to think something, they can't do anything about it anyway. So, okay, fine, we'll let them run the stuff. But what people think in places like Boston and New Haven and New York and Washington, that makes a difference. And as a result, I think you get the highest degree of indoctrination and ideological control in the more elite centers, including the universities, I should say. I think it's kind of hard to prove, but it's an impression. If it's true, it would be understandable. Let's gotta go. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, we have to vacate. Who points this out, but it's clearly the case. They learned that there is a way to maintain something remotely like a capitalist system, namely with massive state subsidy and direction and control. And they're the guys who had to know it because they were running it. So they didn't have to read it in textbooks, they had experienced it. Overcame the Depression with a big shot in the arm to the economy. Right after the war, there was a consensus, extremely broad consensus, going from economists like then young Paul Samuelson and others all the way across to business leaders, that if this government stimulus and support were to drop, we'd head right back to the Depression, which was pretty realistic. That's what pulled the country out of the Depression. Anyway, that was the consensus. And you don't have to go to secret sources at this time. The business press quite openly said that the government is going to have to do something about it. Fortune magazine pointed out that high-tech industry cannot survive in an unsubsidized, competitive, free enterprise economy. Business Week added that the government has to be the savior. There was pretty general agreement on this. It was understood, just like you learn in your elementary economics course, that any kind of government spending can serve as a stimulus, like social spending or military spending or, you know, hiding dollars in the sand or whatever you like. They'll all work. They understood this. And in fact, there was a debate in the business press in the late 40s about which path to follow, social spending or military spending. And it was decided pretty quickly, explicitly in fact, that military spending would be a much better path. The reason was that social spending has a downside, even if it would work. First of all, it's redistributive. Secondly, it has a democratizing effect, because like people sort of care where you're going to build a hospital or something. It's also not a direct gift to corporations. It sort of just filters indirectly. Well, military spending has none of these defects. It's a direct gift to corporations. It's redistributive, but the right way. And it has no democratizing effect. In fact, quite the opposite. People have no opinion on what kind of jet plane to build or something. So it's just perfect. And furthermore, it's easy to sell, and that was recognized too. The point was put rather succinctly by Truman's the first Air Force Secretary, Secretary Simon, from the early 1970s. There's no time to go into this, but the early 1970s are important. That's when the financial systems were deregulated after the Nixon administration broke down the Bretton Woods Agreement, something which had had an enormous effect on the international economy, probably the biggest change in world order since World War II, but takes us off in another direction, so I'll drop it. Important direction. Well, all of these things have had effects. One of the effects is the unprecedented redistribution of income toward the very rich that is complained about and attributed to the free market, and also the steady decline of the majority as we're moving towards a society which has notable structural similarities to the third world. It's very rich countries. It's not going to look like Brazil, but the structural similarities are quite obvious. I mean, take any third world country, and now Eastern Europe, now that it's going back to the third world where it belongs, and was for 5 centuries. There's a small sector, kind of like an island of extreme wealth and privilege. There's a big sector kind of ranging from suffering to outright misery. And there's just a lot of superfluous people who don't contribute to profit making, and you got to get rid of them somehow. In countries like, well, say, take the country that gets most of our military aid in the 1990s in the hemisphere, Colombia, there they get rid of them by just murdering them. That's what the military aid is for. Social cleansing, large-scale killing by the military and the paramilitary and so on. We're more civilized. We don't kill them. We throw them into jail. So the jails are going way up, incarceration is completely uncorrelated with crime, far beyond any industrial society. In fact, we now are competing with the World Championship with China, and have been for some years and still going up. So that's a superfluous population. None of this is the result of the wisdom of the market, miraculous or not, but it is definitely the result of explicit social policy. Well, these effects, I should say, have led to real euphoria among the winners. The business press is pretty amazing in this respect. So in Business Week, in a review of 1996, points out that profits were spectacular. That's up from dazzling and stunning in the 2 previous years of double-digit profit growth, which is in Truman's secretary. He pointed out that, as he put it, the word to use is not subsidy, the word to use is security. And if you can get people to tremble in fear, you can carry out the subsidy, calling it security. So military spending is the perfect solution to the problem that, as everyone recognized, the capitalist system just isn't viable, and there has to be a massive public subsidy for it and some degree of intervention and control. Well, that was very widely understood. It soon turned to a kind of international military Keynesianism, as it's sometimes called. The revival of Japan and Europe very crucially depended on U.S. military spending after the meager and disappointing effects of the Marshall Plan were played out. But they did get revitalized for the Korean War and big military spending and so on. The Vietnam War had the same highly stimulating effect, at this time also for South Korea, which traces its economic takeoff to that. By 1940, and this is well understood, in fact, even before the Korean War, by 1948, the business press was hailing Truman's Cold War spending as a magic formula for almost endless good times. It's a way to inject new strength into the entire economy. By 1952, it was quoting, obvious that foreign economies as well as our own are mainly dependent on the scope of continued arms spending in this country, which is serving as a cover for public subsidy under the guise of security, subsidy to advanced industry. I'm quoting Steel Magazine and Magazine of Wall Street in this case. But it's typical, you know, it's all across the board in the business press. And so the story continues. Just about everywhere. Take, say, computers, like sort of core element of a modern industrial society. In the 1950s, they were kind of big, clunky things with the vacuum tubes always blowing up and too much paper around and that sort of business. You couldn't sell them, in other words. So the public support for them was about 100%. They were designed under the security guise, like at Lincoln Labs at MIT, where I am, and where actually my wife worked as a programmer with a security clearance, so I wasn't supposed to know what was happening. They were designing what was called an air defense system. I doubt that anybody in it thought it was ever going to stop anything but maybe a World War I fighter plane that got lost. But the air defense system did develop the basic architecture and software and structure for modern computers. When it got advanced enough, some of the leading figures in that pulled out. One of them formed Dell, later IBM came along, and so on. By the 1960s, these things were marketable, and the public support reduced to about 50%, and it sort of oscillates up and back. In the 1980s, it went up again because there were fifth-generation computers coming along and parallel processing and all sorts of new fancy stuff, so the public share went up again. And this is pretty public, I should say. Like, say, Star Wars was sold to the public as a system, you know, we're going to defend ourselves from Martians or somebody. But to the business world, it was sold pretty frankly as just a subsidy to next generation of computer technology and lasers and so on and so forth. There was no big secret about it. And what's true of computers is true of just about anything else. In the 50s, about 85% of R&D, research and development, and electronics altogether was publicly subsidized, and it remains at various levels since. I won't go into details. The same is true of the aeronautical industry, of automation is a striking example. It was so inefficient that for several decades it had to be developed in the state sector, finally handed over to private enterprise. Containers and so containerization, machine tools is a dramatic example. It's well studied in this case, an important work by Dave Noble. The energy industry, nobody even argues about. Biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, in fact, just about every dynamic sector of the economy. That even includes services. So one of the biggest parts of the service industries is tourism, huge industry, which is, of course, aircraft-based, and an enormous source of profits for services to US-based companies. And so it goes. We'll skip the rest, but as I say, it's extremely hard to find some dynamic sector of the US economy that doesn't rely on this kind of thing fairly crucially. Sometimes overwhelmingly, sometimes less so, but always significantly. Now, there are variations. It's not like a uniform story. So take, say, the Reagan administration. The Reaganites were extreme in their contempt for markets. They really hated them, in practice, that is. To the public, the Reagan administration was full of wonderful praise for the miracles of the free market. That's both to the third world and to poor people at home. To the business world, they were sending a different message. So Secretary of Treasury James Baker informed the business world that the Reagan administration, he boasted that they had instituted more protection for American business than any administration in post-war American history, which was in fact far too modest. It was more protection than all post-war administrations combined. They had virtually doubled one or another form of protection, amounting to tariffs, though sometimes by the devices. That was used, targeted specifically, to save the American steel industry, automotive industry, machine tools, semiconductors. It's unnecessary for aircraft because it's already publicly subsidized. That's what saved them. Otherwise, it would, if the free market had been allowed to function, they presumably would have been taken over by much cheaper and more efficient Japanese and other industries. But the market was effectively closed, and a lot of subsidies were poured in, and that saved the industries. And again, it's no secret. So like Foreign Affairs, in its review of the decade, points out later, I'm quoting it now, that the United States shifted in the 1980s from the world champion of multilateral free trade to one of its leading challengers, with the greatest swing toward protectionism since the 1930s. That much is true, but it's only a small part of the story because it omits the huge public subsidies to high-tech industry, the initiation of new technologies, startup companies, the unprecedented public bailouts, the biggest nationalization in American history, and a lot more. There's a scholarly study of GATT by one of the chief economists of the GATT Secretariat, sort of the main study of GATT in the modern period. He estimates, Patrick Lowe is his name, he estimates Reaganite restrictions on free trade as about 3 times any foreign counterpart. This is, what he says, part of the sustained assault on free trade principles by the industrial countries.